welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Folks, Richard Corben is the subject of today's episode, and he is a bit of an enigmatic artist. He didn't do very many interviews, so mostly his art is going to speak for itself. Now, he is a distinct voice in comics. He's also a pioneer in coloring techniques, but mostly he's appropriate for this season because he has some notable credits in horror. We're talking about underground comics like Rolf, to professional stuff like Vampirella, and eventually one of Hellboy's best stories, The Crooked Man. Today, I'm going to talk about Richard Corben's career and art techniques through the lens of a specific horror comic he made, really comics, adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe's poems and short stories. So please consider hitting like and subscribe. That really helps the channel, especially in a day and age where YouTube's algorithm has gone through some changes. I'll keep it simple. But without any further ado, let's get into it. Richard Corben was born on a farm in Anderson, Missouri in the fall of 1940, and he stayed in the area his whole life. He got a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the Kansas City Art Institute in 1965. He then went on to work for several years at Calvin Communications, a Kansas City-based company that produced industrial, educational, and training films. Corben's job involved camera work, animation, and film editing. It was the kind of meticulous hands-on production that honed his understanding of lighting, values, and how to display motion. While in some interviews he seems to regret how long he stayed there, he started writing and drawing underground comics simultaneously. His first published comic was Monsters Rule in 1968's fanzine Voice of Comicdom, issue 12. While at Calvin Communications, Corben also animated his fantasy character Den for the first time, who he'd later re-envision at Heavy Metal magazine, and then Heavy Metal adapted it into another animation for their movie. An animation that Corben did not love, by the way. But in the meantime, Richard Corben wanted to break into comics, and he did a lot of black and white stories, including the well-regarded Rolf, and even started his own self-published stuff like Fantagor. A big challenge at the time was to find a platform for your own comics if you didn't want to just do superheroes. By 1970, Richard Corben began to reach a larger audience by making short stories for Warren Publishing. He did a lot of stories for their horror anthologies, Creepy and Eerie, as well as 3 Vampirella stories. In 1975, the European artists Mobius, Droulet, and Jean-Pierre Dionnet started publishing the anthology comic Metal Irland. Corben was one of the few American artists invited to submit to them, and he adapted a short underground comics version of Den into a 2-parter for the magazine. He then expanded that even further into a 12-part story for the launch of the American version of the magazine, Heavy Metal, beginning in 1977. 1977 was also the year that Meatloaf's album Bat Out of Hell was released, and Richard Corben was hired to paint the album cover. That earned him a lot of notoriety. Corben was able to build himself his own career. He was making underground comics and independent stuff for both Europe and the US, and it really allowed him a freedom not every comics artist enjoys. He had complete control over his story's composition and pacing, and most importantly, the content itself. The type of stories he wanted to tell involved grotesque beasts and sensual ladies. It allowed Corben to perfect his style of illustrating unique, 3-dimensional characters that looked like they could have been statues or puppets as easily as drawings or paintings. A technical landmark from early on was his color overlay technique. Before computers, Corben used acetate overlays, airbrush, zipatone, and some other tools. He took a multimedia approach to creating his comics pages. The result was glossy and smooth skin tones and gritty landscapes. He described some of this technique in a contentious 1981 interview he gave to Heavy Metal, saying, quote,
I have a conscious influence from the Baroque and Renaissance artists, such as Rembrandt and Michelangelo, and from the Greek and the Roman too, the classic period where they had the fully rounded statues. I guess in graphic terms, what I mean is trying to make the work simplified in some ways or ornate in some ways. I try to be inventive in every way, not only in the stories I do, but in the techniques I use. I invented a technique, my system of color overlays, which apparently nobody can understand, but it's really very simple. The luminescent quality of my color overlays is derived from the way I combine the colors. I shoot the photomechanical separations myself, to a slightly higher contrast than a normal photo engraver would do. This makes the colors appear brighter. I'm excited when I do finally see the colors. I can see if my ideas work well or not so well.
As Corben matured, he continued to evolve his techniques, adopting digital coloring tools, but he always retained that sense of painterly effect, depth, texture, and control. But art was only half of the equation, as he was writing his own stories. His narrative sensibility mixes fantasy, horror, eroticism, psychological paranoia, grotesque realism, bodily exaggeration, moody lighting, and the horror of body transformation, and even deterioration. His work in animation meant his comics had a cinematic storytelling quality, detailed settings, clear and intentional actions by the characters, and even editing style effects like jumps in continuity to, say, resemble a match cut in film. His barbarian character Den wasn't the only story he would return to. In the mid-70s, Corben began adapting the poetry and short stories of Edgar Allan Poe into comics for Warren Publications, and he made more in 2006 for Marvel's mature audience's Max line of comics. They've since been collected by Dark Horse into the volume Spirits of the Dead. Corben's interest in Poe is long-standing. In interviews, he's mentioned that the Roger Corman film adaptations was his first exposure to the stories. But in high school, he read Poe's texts and found much more substance and depth than the movies had suggested. Comics started in the Golden Age with all short-form anthology books. It spun out of pulp magazines and newspaper strips. In both, you had to have short, punchy stories that grabbed the attention of the reader right away. That continued as comics evolved into the horror and war and crime anthologies by EC Comics, which all helped influence Richard Corben. Poe's material was perfect for comics adaptation, and Corben spoke about this in a 2012 interview he did with the Comics Journal. He told them, quote,
"My first intent was to do so-called faithful adaptations, but now I feel a faithful adaptation is not possible in any medium by anybody. My early impressions of Poe's work came from Roger Corman's, Richard Matheson's versions of some Poe stories. Other than the titles, these films have very little to do with Poe's stories. After thinking about other possible directions they might have taken, other possible amplifications, they all represent a departure from the original intent. However, this certainly won't stop countless writers and artists and me from doing their own take on Poe's stories. So, resolved not to do faithful adaptations, I am freed to let the inspiration flow. Yes, the stories and poems are springboards for my interpretations."
Fidelity to Poe would have changed his pacing when adapting it for comics. In Corben's work, he focuses on the meanings behind the story. He would emphasize the psychological landscape with stories about obsession, dread, fear, madness, and loneliness, and he'd make it literal. For instance, let's look at The City in the Sea, Corben's adaptation of the 1831 poem by Poe, The Doomed City. The poem describes a majestic, ancient city that rises beside a black, motionless sea. Its towers, temples, and domes gleam faintly under a melancholy sky, but there are no signs of life, only silence and stillness. The city's architecture is grand but decaying, suggesting both beauty and ruin. Above this eerie city, death reigns supreme. The poem portrays him as a dark, motionless god who presides over a realm of endless night. The setting feels outside of time, a place where the sun never rises and souls never rest. In the comic adaptation, a ship captain wakes up to a lonely island and finds himself accused of losing precious cargo. He angrily defends himself, saying nothing of value was lost and it was covered by insurance anyway. Ultimately, it's revealed that in a dangerous storm, the ship captain tossed African slaves overboard, thus damning him to this quiet island, and he is in hell. For an adaptation of one of Poe's most famous stories, The Fall of the House of Usher, Corben combined it with the oval portrait. The comic follows the narrator, who Corben cleverly names Allan after Poe. He meets Usher, who compulsively paints grotesque and morbid images, but Usher's main desire is to capture a perfect portrait of his sister, Madeline, who he is desperately in love with. As in the oval portrait, when Usher perfects his painting, Madeline drops dead, her soul somehow captured by the painting. From there, the story takes the subtext of the Usher's family being weird and corrupt and makes it literal, with decaying corpses in the basement and the literal collapse of the old house. But Corben also adds his own uncomfortable details, like this bit of spittle when Usher is discovered by Allan to be kissing the painting he made of his sister. Corben's character design to keep Usher's eyes mostly hidden from us behind glasses helped to make the character inscrutable and unknowable, so that we relate to Allan's feelings of isolation and paranoia being stuck at such a disturbing house. If you look back at the early black and white versions of Corben's Poe adaptations from Warren, you can see that he has complete control over his values, and the stories do not need color. Rather, they benefit from the Gothic aesthetic. But Corben acknowledged that it was a factor in helping to sell comics, and his colorization for Spirits of the Dead are certainly very strong. Mask of the Red Death benefits mightily from the red hues, but even scenes with royalty bump up the contrast on the colors, making it a gaudy affair and telling us something about the characters. The Poe stories give Corben access to the stuff that he's good at. Hairy monsters in The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Gore and viscera in Conqueror Worm. Gorgeous women in The Premature Burial. The Premature Burial has a meta aspect where we already may feel guilty for objectifying a woman, but the one in this story is assumed to be dead, so we, the reader, are nearly as guilty as the character digging her up. Corben emphasized internal dread. In this adaptation, more than any external horror, he seeks to show obsession, the dread of being buried alive, terror of premature death, and, of course, isolation. Corben addressed that taboo line between life and death in an interview with Fangoria, saying, quote, "There is a strong sexual part of the story that is usually ignored in the adaptations. This is surprising because you would think that would be the part that could be the most interesting and easily emphasized," end quote. In one of Poe's adaptations for the Warren magazines, for The Raven, he used live models, his friend Herb Arnold and his wife, to pose for Lenore and other characters in the story. This contributes to the emotional realism and the expressions of his characters. Richard Corben would sometimes sculpt models as well. It helps explain how much control Corben has over the lighting and the rendering of his characters. Especially when it comes to his horror stories, Corben used layout to control tempo, large panels to slow pace, or to emphasize environment, smaller or tightly framed panels to convey dread, anxiety, and claustrophobia. He also used his animation and editing techniques to show juxtaposition of memory or flashback sequences, and whether he used grayscale and screen tones or muted colors, he knew how to use these tones to give a mood to his artwork. Just look at how the House of Usher exists in a haze of fog, which not only sets the scene as a remote place, but it literally uses empty space in the composition to isolate it from anything else. A great use of negative space. In Corben's adaptation of The Raven, the narrator's memories of Lenore are rose-tinted, idealized, which contrasts later with muted decay in the present. In his adaptations, Richard Corben often makes literal an aspect from Poe's poems. Poe's 1843 poem Conqueror Worm features angels watching a play, but the stage is really all of humanity's existence, and at the end, a giant worm devours humanity. In Corben's adaptation, it's much more intimate. A ruthless colonel in the Old West encounters a strange worm. Soon, he gets to a town and watches a play like Hamlet, but he gets offended, and when he goes backstage, the cast is being devoured by worms. Soon, so is he and everyone else. In the past, there have been critics who have questioned whether Corben's work is pornographic, but he aptly addressed this by saying perhaps sensual, because that's always going to be an individual opinion, not a hard and fast line. Richard Corben kept working consistently into his later years. He collaborated with Brian Azzarello on an arc of Hellblazer, and he did Hellboy stories with Mike Mignola. He achieved awards at the Eisners in 2009 and Angoulême's Comics Festival in 2018. Many popular artists and comics have credited Richard Corben as a direct influence. These include Mike Mignola, Eric Powell, Simon Beasley, Frank Miller, and Will Eisner, among other big names. If your only exposure to Richard Corben has been, say, his incredible Hellboy story, The Crooked Man, or some of the weird animation of Den from the Heavy Metal movie back in the 80s, I'd push you to dig deeper. He's someone that guided his own career from underground to indie to mainstream, but he kept his work consistent and his own. And for horror, I think an underrated but brilliant example into all the different ways we can be afraid as humans are his great adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe. Sadly, Corben passed at age 80 with some complications from heart surgery, but I think that we would all be lucky to fit as much into those 80 years as Corben fit into his. Before I leave you, I want to thank you for watching. I also want to thank my supporters on Patreon and my members on YouTube. And I came across a fantastic site called Muda.net, which has the most comprehensive list of Richard Corben's work and interviews that I've ever seen. It was a huge advantage once I started digging into more research for this episode. And I'll include a link to that below in the description, where you can learn more about this masterful comics creator. Thanks so much for watching. I've got a few more thoughts that I'll give you over the closing credits, but until I see you next time, keep reading comics. All right, everybody, thank you so much for watching. It always means a lot to me. I'd be very curious to know, what are some of your favorite horror comics? Not just of the past year, I mean of all time. I think I've covered a lot of different types of horror comics because it's just an aspect of comics that I really, really love. But I'd be curious to hear if there's anything that I've overlooked, or maybe even something that I love but I haven't thought to make an episode about. So I just wanted to cover Richard Corben for a very long time, and I kept mulling it over because he's got a really impressive bibliography. You know, he's got so many great comics, and I'm going, you know, how do you cover it all? And then all of a sudden it just clicked this year, and I was like, he's the perfect subject for an October spooky season episode. And within that, I could like really drill down into one of my personal favorites, his Edgar Allan Poe adaptations. Because I think a lot of people would say, okay, if you're talking horror, you got to talk either Rolf or The Crooked Man, and total respect. Those are fantastic, absolutely fantastic bangers of stories. Real quick, I want to say thank you so much to Matt Draper for doing some voiceover in this episode. Matt is a YouTube creator that I really respect. He started off doing a bunch of comic book analysis, and I always loved not just his opinions, but his editing. And once he sort of felt like that area was getting a little crowded, he moved much more into movie analysis, and sometimes, you know, related like TV, but mostly like movie analysis. And he's got a great Patreon page because he does extra content for his Patreon subscribers. I support him there. I really, really like him. So I was just like, hey Matt, would you be able to do this? It's horror related. So I thought maybe that would be enough to capture his interest. And fortunately, he was kind enough to do that. So thank you, Matt. And I really recommend checking out his channel, Matt Draper. Thanks, everybody. See you real soon. The Crooked Man. Today, great. Let's take that again. Comics started in a gold... No, kitty. Suggesting both beauty and ruin. If you look back at the early black and white versions of Corben... Corben often makes literal an aspect from Poe.